Stress or relaxation? Which one is running your metabolism? The autonomic nervous system is your body's control center for things you don't even think about, like heart rate, digestion, and blood sugar. It has two main branches, the sympathetic system, fight or flight, and the parasympathetic system, rest and digest. The problem is that too many of us live stuck in fight or flight. Things like stress, poor sleep, late night snacking keep our engines revving when we should be resting. The good news is that you can tip the balance back. Breathing exercises, good sleep, exercising at the right time of day, and avoiding evening sugar spikes all help strengthen your rest and digest system. To watch the full lecture, click the link in my bio. Looking to improve your own metabolic health? Visit insuliniq.com for courses, coaching, consultations, and a 10-day free community membership trial. To dive deep into the science behind metabolic health, become an insider at benbikman.com, where you'll enjoy my exclusive content, ad-free podcasts, live stream Q&A access, and more. Welcome to the Metabolic Classroom. I'm Benjamin Bikman, a biomedical scientist and professor of cell biology. Indeed, I am your guest professor for this mini lecture, and it's a classic, today's topic. It's one of the basics in the realm of physiology. Today, we are discussing the autonomic nervous system, or sometimes just abbreviated as ANS. This system, in a way, is like the conductor of the orchestra within the body, and it is directing processes that are almost too many to count, but all of them are working to keep us alive and indeed thriving. This is things like how rapidly the heart is beating, how hard it's beating, how quickly are your intestines moving food, and how well are you digesting stuff. And even cell biology in the realm of metabolism and metabolic processes like blood sugar. My goal in this mini lecture is to break down the autonomic nervous system, help you understand its two main branches, how this influences your health, and what you might even be able to do to optimize your autonomic nervous system to help you live an even healthier life. All right, so let's start with the basics, being just defining the autonomic nervous system. It's a division of the peripheral nervous system. Now, that is distinct from the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. So this is the nervous system that is out in the body. That's the peripheral component, but not to be confused with the part of the nervous system that moves your muscles around. That's the somatic nervous system. So when you think about the nervous system down the brain and spinal column, that's the central nervous system. The somatic nervous system is its own part, being the part of you that animates your body, where you are in control of your muscles, specifically your skeletal muscles, like walking or lifting weights or jumping. Or even me talking right now, where I'm using skeletal muscle to control my intake of breath, to control the movement of my tongue and my jaw to speak to you. That's all the somatic. But the autonomic handles all of the involuntary stuff. As much as I am voluntarily moving my body, or not at the moment, the autonomic handles the things we can't directly control. These are the things we don't consciously control, like, as I said, heart rate or blood pressure or breathing rate or digestion, even, as I said, aspects of metabolism like glucose levels. For example, you can't just sit there and lower your blood pressure by 10 points. You can't increase it by 10 points. You might be able to increase it a little by forcing yourself to hyperventilate or by flexing muscles and things, but you're not going to have a sustained effect just because you will it to be so. It's responding to what you can change, but you can't control the response. So all the things you don't control when you think about what's happening out in your body, you can look at that as being under the umbrella of the autonomic nervous system. But what it's always doing is trying to maintain homeostasis, that delicate balance within the body that keeps your body operating well. Now, like most things in the body, the autonomic nervous system operates through feedback systems. So there's going to be a sensor. This could be something like a baroreceptor, which is sensors in your blood vessels that sense your blood pressure. Then there's going to be integrators. So something that processes the signal. And this is typically going to be somewhere in the central nervous system, like in the brain, the hypothalamus, something that's getting in the signal and then sending something back out to actually do something about the signal. That's going to be the effector. So we had a sensor, then we had an integrator, then we have an effector. That's going to be something like the heart. So if we go back to blood pressure, if your blood pressure is too low, the baroreceptors are sensing that. That's the sensor. That signal goes to the brain or to the central nervous system. Then a signal comes out, and it would go to, say, the heart and tell the heart to beat harder and faster, all in an effort to try to increase blood pressure. Now, back to the autonomic nervous system in a general or high-level view, it is split into two main branches. That's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And today in the mini lecture, we'll focus on the sympathetic and these parasympathetic branches, as they are the main. Of course, they constitute the autonomic nervous system, but they also have effects throughout the body in ways that are very relevant that you know intuitively, but some you might find a little surprising. Let's start with the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight part of the body. That is often what it's called. When we teach these principles, or you read about them, or you learn about them, you learn about the sympathetic as the fight or flight. And it's called that for good reason. The sympathetic nervous system is designed to prepare the body for action when faced with stress or danger. So imagine you are hiking and you spot a bear. Your sympathetic system kicks into high gear. These neurons will primarily use epinephrine binding to adrenergic receptors. Now, I'm going to mention some of these later. These are alpha and beta receptors. They fall into two general categories, alpha or beta adrenergic receptor. And then these receptors are going to trigger the response. They're going to be responding to the epinephrine. Now, that name, adrenergic, has a word that might sound familiar. Indeed, might be more familiar than epinephrine, that is adrenaline. That term adrenergic, referring to the receptors that bind epinephrine, come from the word adrenaline, and adrenaline is another word for epinephrine. It's basically from the US or the UK schools of thinking. Epinephrine here in the US, or my English, British, Isles counterparts would be calling it, or maybe anywhere in the Commonwealth, would be calling it adrenaline. And those receptors are named after the word adrenaline. Now, what does this look or feel like? Well, when epinephrine is up and the sympathetic nervous system is on or dominant, this would be something like the pupils dilating, heart rate is going to go up. At the same time, our blood vessels systemically, so the blood vessels that are going out through the body to the muscles, actually constrict. Now, that doesn't mean that blood flow is down, because if you are beating the heart harder and faster and blood vessels are narrower, it actually increases the blood flow. It increases the speed overall of blood flow. So now blood is moving through the body faster. And that's all fine, because at the same time, you are mobilizing a lot more energy. So you have a lot more lipolysis. So you're breaking down a lot of fat. You are breaking down glycogen in the liver. So you're mobilizing a lot of glucose. And so all of this is a coordinated system to really move energy around. But speaking of glycogenolysis, so there's obviously an effect at the liver. And this is through the receptors that are called beta 2. So when beta 2 receptors are activated, they will result in the release of glucose into the blood for very quick fuel, for the working muscle to get you away from the bear, for example. Now, in adipose tissue, there's different receptors. There's beta 3 adrenergic receptors, and those will trigger lipolysis, the breakdown of fat. So the breakdown of triglycerides, the stored form of fat, into free fatty acids. So that's what's getting released into the blood. But also in brown fat, when beta 3 adrenergic receptors are activated, that results in ramping up of thermogenesis. So mitochondrial uncoupling turns on, and that starts to generate heat. Now, these responses are life-saving when they happen in short bursts, like you need to perform, you need to get away from something, or you need to get through a tough workout or perform in some athletic event. But as we'll get to later, you can have too much of this. You can have the sympathetic nervous system on for too long. So that's something that we're going to get to called sympathetic overdrive. Now, very briefly, I don't want to get into that too much yet because I have a different, I want to put that as its own topic. But one of the consequences of too much of this signal, of say too much epinephrine or too much of a sympathetic tone, it's like we're keeping our foot on the gas pedal and we're never braking. We're just revving the engine. And if you've paid attention to some of my mini lectures in the past, you know that stress is one of the key causes of insulin resistance. And that is relevant here. When epinephrine is elevated for an extended period of time, it drives insulin resistance. You start to reduce the sensitivity of the insulin receptor to insulin. Now, that helps epinephrine increase blood glucose, which to a degree it wants to do to help fuel muscle, for example, for you to perform physically. But as that continues to happen, especially if the demands of the muscle for energy are down, in other words, you're not exercising, then you can start to see how this creates a problem. So it's like there's a mismatch between the expectations on the body and the sympathetic nervous system to meet those expectations. So normally, you have an increased demand for energy and performance because you need to perform. Well, then the sympathetic nervous system becomes active and helps you do that. But what if you don't need to physically perform and you're just sitting down doing nothing, but you have too much sympathetic tone? Well, now you're mobilizing energy without it going anywhere. Insulin resistance will be a part of that, and I'll come back to some other consequences of that in just a moment. Before we do that, let's just go to the other branch within the autonomic nervous system and discuss the parasympathetic. Whereas the sympathetic is commonly just called the fight or flight, reflecting some of its main actions, parasympathetic is often referred to as rest and digest. This system is all about recovery, conserving energy, and even rebuilding. The actions are going to be calming the body, so slowing the heart rate, stimulating digestion, so enhancing peristalsis or the movement of food through the intestines, thereby enhancing nutrient absorption, and even promoting insulin release. So the parasympathetic system, as we'll get to in just a moment, will regulate some direct control of insulin. Now, the vagus nerve is a superstar in the parasympathetic nervous system, and it's responsible for about 80% of all of the parasympathetic actions or outflow. The vagus nerve connects the brain to organs, and this is why it's so relevant because of what it connects to. It connects to the heart, it connects to the lungs, to the intestines, to the the liver, the pancreas. You can see how it is so connected. So let's just discuss a brief example. After a meal, you eat a meal, parasympathetic activity ramps up. It's going to boost saliva production. It's going to enhance the movement of the food through the intestines. It enhances insulin secretion from the beta cells, just preparing the body, saying, hey, there's some glucose coming. Let's get ready to handle this glucose. Let's take it in and store it for later use. This is actually part of the cephalic phase of insulin secretion. This is how a person can taste something sweet. And in some instances, this is not a universal phenomenon, in some instances, actually see an insulin release. It's like the brain. Now, we sometimes trick the brain where we taste something sweet and there's not going to be glucose coming in as a result of that. Well, fructose, which would be what's tasting sweet, but fructose would be coming with some degree of glucose as well. So we taste something sweet, and then the brain through the parasympathetic, through the vagus and the parasympathetic system tells the pancreas, hey, something's coming, some glucose is coming, so get ready. And part of that getting ready would be releasing insulin. Now, there is some part here that's interesting and can be leveraged. There's an aspect of the parasympathetic that is leveraged for obesity treatments. You can actually implant a device in someone where it's connected to the vagus nerve, and it will deliver an electrical pulse that will stop the vagal signal coming through the abdomen. And you can, identify specific branches. So this is not only going to enhance, it's going to promote a sense of satiety. You can slow the intestines down, making the person eat less because they just feel full. But you can also lower insulin levels because you start to block that vagus signal to the beta cells of the pancreas that, when they're stimulating, are telling the beta cells to release insulin. So you can implant a literal electric device to shock the vagus to stop it from working very well. Now, there's going to be consequences to this, but one outcome is the person will lose weight. Maybe they're going to have hyperglycemia. Maybe they're going to have poor gastric motility and feel very uncomfortable and bloated and nauseated, but some people will take it. So you can lose weight with these vagal shocking devices. Okay, now let's come back to a broader view, how the autonomic nervous system can affect health. A well-balanced autonomic nervous system is a hallmark of, you could say, resilience. It allows the body to respond to stress appropriately and recover well. High parasympathetic tone is one that is reliably measured through heart rate variability, or HRV. And it is absolutely associated with better cardiovascular health outcomes, even lower inflammation, and even better metabolic outcomes like improved insulin sensitivity and glucose control. HRV reflects the variation in the time between heartbeats. So it's not just that you have a low heartbeat. If a person only ever had a low heartbeat, there's not a lot of variability. It's that there's a swing. It indicates that your autonomic nervous system is flexible, for lack of a better term, and it is shifting between sympathetic and parasympathetic dominance, which is normal. That's the way it's supposed to be. Heart rate is a little higher and then it's a little lower, even matching with your breathing. You take a breath in, and that increased volume will result of air inhaling will increase the heart rate briefly. When you breathe out, it will reduce the heart rate. So you want that variability. So high HRV, in other words, a lot of variability, means better adaptability or shifting between the two branches of the autonomic nervous system, a good balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic, while low HRV usually signals a degree of rigidity and with heart risks coming from health risks coming from that. And usually it's a sign of too much sympathetic. Now, let's talk about that a little more. Sympathetic overdrive was first coined or described back in 1988 by Esler, E-S-L-E-R. And it was specifically in the context of studying hypertension. That's not surprising. Someone with hypertension, in many instances, may have too much sympathetic nervous system activity. One of the reasons why our blood pressure goes up when we exercise is because of that sympathetic tone. That sympathetic nervous system constricting the blood vessels, stimulating the heart to beat a little harder and faster. It really just means that the fight or flight system is stuck in high gear. That constant surge of epinephrine, it might help. A singular moment of epinephrine is certainly a good thing to get to perform well. But when you don't need that performance, you want the epinephrine to go away. So you want the epinephrine to drop when the demand is down. But with the chronic overdrive, it's not going down. And one consequence, as I noted, would be insulin resistance, that you desensitize the body to insulin, which is an obvious effect that I've articulated previously. But one other effect that I've never discussed is the effect on the mitochondria. Chronic stimulation through epinephrine actually accelerates the electron transport system, where you're sending electrons through too quickly almost, and then the electrons get mishandled, if you will. And complex 1 and complex 3 of the 4 main complexes of the electron transport system, 1 and 3 can mishandle or fumble the electron, and then the electron will bind to an oxygen prematurely and generate reactive oxygen species. So you have oxidative stress molecules. And then these oxidative stress molecules, the ROS, reactive oxygen species, the ROS, can damage mitochondrial DNA, proteins, membranes, and actually compromise mitochondrial function in the end. Now, that's a problem. And here's a twist, because when you have the sympathetic nervous system turned on, when epinephrine is elevated, you will have lipolysis, fat cells that are breaking down the triglycerides. I mentioned that earlier. The stored triglyceride releasing its 3 fatty acids. So you have fat that is going into the blood to be burned. But a group in 2000, and I shared this in the citation in the American Journal of Physiology, they found that you can get an uncoupling of these two processes of the releasing of the fat combined with the mitochondria's ability to burn that fat. So they infused epinephrine into humans that were exercising, and they found this mismatch that while free fatty acids can flood the blood, the mitochondria can't always keep up. So the oxidation or the burning of that fat didn't match the availability, the breakdown, and the release of that fat. Instead, what they found is that the fatty acids were getting re-esterified or converted back into triglycerides. Now, that can happen in the fat cells, but what's more troubling is the degree to which that could be happening in non-fat tissues. In other words, as you are pulling in those free fatty acids and storing them, maybe you're storing it in the muscle, maybe you're storing it in the pancreas, maybe you're storing it in the liver. So it could be driving this phenomenon called ectopic fat storage, where you're storing the fat in tissues that are not meant to store fat. So that's part of this overdrive phenomenon, where you have a little too much activity too chronically of epinephrine. It's doing too much. It doesn't stop there, because the catecholamines can also constrict. Catecholamines is a term for epinephrine and its close brother molecule, norepinephrine. But then I realize now I had not mentioned the word catecholamines, so that's a term to describe these hormones. But catecholamines will also constrict the blood vessels, as I noted earlier, but also increase oxidative stress in the blood vessels. And that can result in damage to the endothelium. So the person may have higher blood pressure. They could have a higher risk of atherosclerosis now. They may have a higher risk of arrhythmias, where the heart is just always beating so much faster that it may start to miss some beats or beat inappropriately. At the same time, too much sympathetic tone for too long will slow the gut too much. It will reduce motility, which can affect the microbiome. It can affect the integrity of the gut membrane or the leakiness, increasing inflammation. So there are GI consequences as well. Now, in contrast to all of this, the parasympathetic system, the rest and digest arm, is going to protect these sorts of phenomena, or it's going to reverse them. And primarily through the vagus, you're going to have more of an anti-inflammatory signal, a reduction in cytokines, a vasorelaxation, a slowing of the heart, a lowering of the blood pressure. And so, but now you can't have that all the time either, right? Because you need to perform. Hopefully you are getting up and exercising sometimes. So you need both. I just submit that the average person does have this sympathetic overdrive where there's too much. They're constantly in a state of mild stress, and that's overwhelmingly going to be a consequence of lifestyle, the modern life, which is driving a person to be a little too much sympathetic, which is counterintuitive, isn't it? As we have so much more convenience in life, you think that we would have too much parasympathetic, and yet we end up, our convenience ends up working against us. All right, so let's talk about some of the practical aspects to this, or one more thought here, actually, before I move on to practical application, is maybe a little too influenced by my own scenario, who have such a struggle with evening snacking. So imagine it's 9 p.m., you've settled down, the house is clean, the kids are in bed, or whatever your life would be demanding of you. The demands are gone for a moment, and now you start craving. One of your little shoulder angels is, in fact, a little devil telling you to go indulge in some junk food. You want cereal or some candy or a bag of chips. These are foods that are loaded with refined carbs and sugars. They're going to cause a huge, rapid spike in blood glucose. You have a big hyperglycemia moment. The body actually responds to this. Part of the response is actually a sympathetic nervous system. You have glucose sensing neurons in the hypothalamus, and even the carotid blood vessels have chemoreceptors that sense this spike in glucose and will initiate a release of the catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So now, while you're trying, at the very moment you're trying to wind down and calm down, in other words, you would want the parasympathetic system to dominate, you end up having an increase in your heart rate, an increase in blood pressure. You have more sympathetic system. So acute hyperglycemia can increase the sympathetic nervous system activity by up to 20%. And it can do so within just as little as an hour, of 30 minutes. Now, of course, this is a problem at night. Of all the times of the day when you want the parasympathetic to be the clear winner within the autonomic nervous system, you're making it lose. You're forcing the sympathetic to spike because of hyperglycemia. So let me just make that clear. Hyperglycemia activates a sympathetic response. So you're revving the engine at the very moment when you're trying to slow the car down. You're trying to calm your body down. The consequence of this is that you have shorter sleeps, deep sleep stages. You have compromised REM sleep, which is critical for memory and mood. And your sleep is very disrupted. Your sleep architecture is terrible and fragmented. A result of this, of course, you don't sleep well. You wake up tired. You have more cortisol because of your bad sleep, which is a different stressor, increasing insulin resistance significantly the next day. And to make it even worse, as you're tired, your craving for a stimulant like caffeine goes up, and caffeine increases epinephrine, which can further activate the sympathetic tone, potentially making the whole thing even worse, just exacerbating this whole cycle of poor sleep. Indulging, leading to poor sleep, leading to further indulgence, albeit on the other end with more caffeine. And it's a metabolic wrecking ball, all because you are mismanaging your autonomic nervous system. So what could you do? I do think there is some good news where you can influence your autonomic nervous system to favor better health. And we'll end with these points. So these are all just some evidence-based strategies. One of them is breath work. This idea of deep diaphragmatic breathing. So you're breathing through your belly and you're breathing through, or with your belly, and you're breathing through your nose. You can do some deep breaths just to help stimulate the vagus nerve. There's something called the 4-7-8 technique where you inhale through your nose for a count of 4 seconds. You hold your breath for 7 seconds, then you exhale for 8 seconds. This has been shown to be just a few minutes every day can dramatically improve your HRV. So lowering your blood pressure, increasing the variability of heart rate, suggesting a better balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic. Exercise, of course, is a very good tool. You want to have a very strategic, deliberate activation of sympathetic to get what's called a parasympathetic rebound. So exercise does this. Ice baths do it as well, very well. And one of the reasons I'm an advocate of ice baths in the morning is in part because of this. Nutrition, of course, I already articulated the problem with spiking your glucose before bed. If you feel like you need to eat something before bed, just do everything you can. Set the stage in such a way that you focus mostly on protein and fat, if not exclusively. And then anything you can do to try to sleep well, like a wind down routine, some gentle stretching, some reading while you're not lying down, a hot shower. All of those are going to promote a greater parasympathetic tone right at the time you want it. I'd like to think that by understanding the balance of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches within the autonomic, that with that knowledge of this basic aspect of physiology, we can make better choices. My hope is that you have learned something interesting, and that interesting feature can help result in some behavioral changes just over time, just compounding, working together to help you have optimal, better metabolic health. And with that, I thank you for joining me in the Metabolic Classroom. Until next time, more knowledge, better health. Looking to improve your own metabolic health? Visit insuliniq.com for courses, coaching, consultations, and a 10-day free community membership trial. To dive deep into the science behind metabolic health, become an insider at benbikman.com, where you'll enjoy my exclusive content, ad-free podcasts, live stream Q&A access, and more.